So we've already looked at the mechanics of breathing, that the physical movements that get air and fresh oxygen into our lungs, and also obviously get rid of carbon dioxide for us. The next thing we need to look at is how we actually get oxygen from our alveoli into the capillaries, which is how we obviously circulate it around our body, and then once it gets to the muscles in the blood, how it gets from the capillaries into the muscle cells. And this is a process called gaseous exchange. This video looks at gaseous exchange at rest, and we look at what happens with oxygen and separately what happens with carbon dioxide. And just clearly, as the specification says there, describe the process of gaseous exchange takes place between the alveoli and the blood and the muscles. So there's two sites where gaseous exchange might happen, at the lungs and at the muscles. And specifically right now we're looking at how this happens at rest. And there's a key term that you must be familiar with, and that's partial pressure. And partial pressure basically means the concentration of a gas there is, relatively how much there is. So as I said, we've already looked at pulmonary ventilation, the breathing mechanics of getting air in and out of our body per minute. And we're going to look at firstly external respiration and then internal respiration, but at rest. And we're specifically going to look at these two key gases. So, external respiration. We've breathed in atmospheric air. So air is has certain partial pressures of the two gases. Oxygen, for example, is about 159 millimeters of mercury. And by the time it gets sucked down through all the air tubes and gets into the alveoli, it's about 105 millimeters of mercury. So alveolar air has a quite high partial pressure. And we've got to clearly get that oxygen through the alveoli walls, through the capillary walls, into the capillaries where it attaches with hemoglobin and goes off around the body. Now the reason this is called external respiration, and this is describing what's happening at the lungs, is because I guess the lungs involve us getting air from external, from outside us, into us. So external respiration is getting oxygen into the blood via the alveoli, and is also getting CO2 from the blood into the alveoli to get rid of it. So we make carbon dioxide out of our muscle cells, we transport it back via our heart to the lungs, and then we need to get it from the blood here into the alveoli and breathed out. And again, these two exchanges are called external respiration. An exam question might ask you to talk about both, as in both gases, or might just ask you to talk about one. The other part then, the final part we need to look at is internal respiration. Again, we're just going to look at what happens at rest, and that is where we have gas exchange at the muscle site. Again, you need to know how this works regarding oxygen and carbon dioxide. So as I said, we have oxygenated blood circulating from the lungs, and we need that oxygen to move into the muscle cells. We also need the carbon dioxide we produce here to move into the blood and be transported away. So the exchanges that go on here at the muscle site is called internal respiration. And I guess it's perhaps, but you can think of it that it's more inside you, further inside you, and that would be make it more internal. Perhaps a way of remembering which is which. Now, critical concepts behind gas exchange. So here we've got an alveolus, a single air sac, and a high partial pressure of oxygen. So when we breathe in oxygen, if you remember, it was about 105 milliliters of mercury. And this is quite a high concentration. In the capillaries that go past, so on this diagram it actually does show the capillaries, but I've got a separate capillary here. So these are the tiny blood vessels that wrap around the alveoli. The blood in here would have a very low partial pressure, or a relatively lower partial pressure of oxygen. Now that's really critical that we've got a place that's high and a place that's lower, because we need a higher and a lower to essentially make a gas move. If you think about a slide as a good analogy, if you had a very flat slide, so it was laid on the floor and you sat on one end, you'd go absolutely nowhere because it was equal in both places. The ends were level. In order for a slide to work, you need a higher end and a lower end, and then you will move from one end to the other. And I guess it's the same principle with gases. We need a higher and a lower in order to make the oxygen or the carbon dioxide, whichever we're talking about, move from one place to another. And it does that, it moves, it diffuses until there's equilibrium, and that means until there's a balance again. So critical to diffusion or gaseous exchange, the movement of gas from one place to another, is the fact that there is a diffusion gradient or a pressure gradient or a concentration gradient where there's a higher and a lower value. And we'll look at this again in a moment. So just to summarise, gases diffuse from a high partial pressure or concentration to a place of lower partial pressure until there's equilibrium. And we've essentially got to have a gradient for this to happen. We can have different degrees of gradient. So just like a slide, we could have a shallow slide or a really steep slide. And if we have and that would be a shallow gradient or a steeper gradient. If we had a shallow gradient, less oxygen or less gas would diffuse. If we had a steeper gradient, i.e. a bigger high and a lower low, we would have more gas diffuse. So the degree of the gradient actually does matter. And that will come into context in the next video when we look at gaseous exchange in exercise. So let's specifically look at oxygen and look at diffusion that occurs, or gaseous exchange that occurs at the lungs at rest. What makes sense? So we breathe air in, we've got lots of oxygen in our lungs, and we need to get it into our blood. So logically, we think oxygen will move from our alveoli, from our lungs, and diffuse into our blood. That just makes sense. And the reason behind it, so the physiology behind it, is because the partial pressure of oxygen, the amount of oxygen we have in our alveoli, is high relative to the partial pressure of oxygen, the amount we have in the passing capillaries that have come back from the body. And here's some actual values. Now you won't need to quote them, but I think it sometimes helps give you an idea. So there's about a partial pressure of about 105 millimeters of mercury in the alveoli. Every time you breathe in, you top up this fresh oxygen. So we always have this high value in the lungs. In the capillaries coming back from the body, you might have a lower value, maybe 40 millimeters of mercury. And if you can picture that slide I showed you, this is the high, this is the lower, and therefore there's a diffusion gradient, and the oxygen will diffuse from high to low and move from the alveoli into the capillaries. All pretty straightforward. And one additional factor is, always remember with these things, we're built for the jobs that we have to do. Now the capillaries and the alveoli are built with very thin membranes, very thin walls, and that's to reduce the distance that these gases have to move from one place to another, to basically make it easier. What about oxygen? So oxygen, we've just described how it moves from inside the alveoli from a high to a low concentration in the blood. Our blood then circulates it via the heart and pumps it out around our body, and it arrives at the muscles. So here we would have blood with a very high partial pressure of oxygen, let's say maybe 105 millimeters of mercury. And you can see here that the partial pressure of oxygen in muscles at rest might be only about 40 millimeters of mercury. So again, we've got a high and we've got a low. The best way again to think of this is what just makes sense, what's logic. We've got oxygen in our blood and we need it at our muscles. Even at rest, we need a little bit of respiration going on. So we need some oxygen to get into our muscles. So ideally, we want a little bit of oxygen to go into our muscles from the blood. And again, because we've got a higher partial pressure of oxygen in our capillaries relative to the lower amount that we've got in our muscles, maybe 40, we do have a diffusion gradient, and therefore the oxygen will diffuse from the capillaries into the muscles. That just makes sense. So that's kind of the story of oxygen, both external respiration, what happens at the lungs, and internal respiration, what happens at the muscles. And we've only talked about oxygen. So the diffusion of carbon dioxide at rest, I've started by looking at the muscles actually this time, and the reason is because this is where carbon dioxide is produced. When you make energy using oxygen in the muscle cells, working aerobically, you actually produce carbon dioxide. The more you work aerobically, the more CO2 you produce. Now, given that we're just talking about at rest, the volume of, or the concentration of CO2 here won't be huge because your muscles might only be working very gently. So the principles are the same. We still need a diffusion gradient for a gas to move from one place to another. Now, the partial pressure of CO2 in the muscles is about 45, and the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood passing the muscles is about 40. And obviously it's not a bigger difference as with oxygen, but there is still a gradient, and therefore CO2 would move into the blood. At the lungs, again, it's the same principle. We would have carbon dioxide returning here at a partial pressure, we said about 45 millimeters of mercury, a little bit higher than the CO2, the PCO2 in the alveoli, which is only 40. So we've got a 45 and a 40. So we've got a higher and a lower. And again, we've got a gradient. So the CO2 will diffuse from the blood into the alveoli where we exhale it, where we get rid of it. And as you can see here, if we end up with a partial pressure of 40 or 45 inside the alveoli, we've still got in the atmosphere only a 0.3 millimeter of mercury partial pressure. So we've got a high and a low. And again, air will travel out, which is obviously what we want. So that's the logic. We want CO2 to move from our muscles into our blood. We then get it carried around in our blood, taken to our lungs, and logically we want it to move from our blood into our alveoli, where we can expel it, we can exhale it. And that is exactly what happens. And you can just pause the video. This is essentially what I've just said. So in summary, external respiration. And you might need to talk about oxygen and CO2 in external respiration, because this talks about the gas exchanges at the lungs, and it could be oxygen, could be carbon dioxide, could be both the question asks you for. Similarly, a summary of internal respiration at the muscles. So again, it could be asking you for one specifically or to describe both. If it just asks you about internal respiration at the muscles or internal respiration, you might describe both gases. The concepts behind gas exchange. It's all about the partial pressures of gases, how much gas you've got in one place, or what the concentration is you've got in one place versus the concentration in another. We need a gradient for gases to move. And actually, whilst we'll look at altitude in another video, but at altitude you actually only have a very low partial pressure of oxygen in the air. And so if you've got low in the alveoli and only a little bit lower in the blood, you won't actually diffuse much oxygen into your blood, and that can be problematic for us, circulating less oxygen than we normally would have. We tend to not do very well. So partial pressure in these two places is critical for gas exchange to happen. The surface area is also very important. So the reason we've got these thousands of tiny singular air sacs, like grapes, the alveoli, rather than one big air sac being our lung, is to maximise surface area. The reason we've got tiny capillaries versus one big blood vessel is to give us an increased surface area. And the more surface area you have, the more you're able to do gas exchange through those surfaces. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, the diffusion distance, the fact that our alveoli are so thin and the capillary walls are so thin, it really helps the gas exchange occur efficiently. So gas exchange at rest takes about 3/4 of a second. So it's really quite quick, and in exercise it's even quicker, just over 1/4 of a second. But even though it's very quick, even during exercise you can still exchange enough gases to enable you to perform well. It's not typically getting oxygen into your body that is a problem at sea level. At altitude it might be different, but at sea level it's absolutely fine. And the red blood cells also increase surface area. They distort a little bit in the capillaries to maximise gas exchange. So blood leaving the lungs is almost always fully saturated, even in heavy exercise. So here's a typical exam question that you might ask. Have a read of that, pause the video, and then here's the mark scheme.